Hello and welcome to a lecture on surplus value and governance. I'll turn to look at the profit motive. We're going to start here. We're going to be looking at the generation of value in the modern company and as an understanding of how governance works from the ways of looking at who should be entitled to a share of that value that's generated, and look at that. And historically, one of the ways of looking at was surplus value, and the idea was that that was paid out as partly profit. It was paid out as profit, so as dividends, etc., and partly was reinvested back into the company as part of the system of capitalist accumulation, which of course is the capitalism is about capital accumulation, which is where the name comes from. But also, it's also about the idea of who controls that. And historically, 200 years ago, when this was first being discussed, you'd have pretty much expected that to be controlled by the capital, people who owned the mills and the factories, etc. But we see that these days the concept of ownership and the concept of control of capital is much more varied. But I still think the basic principle of surplus value is still very relevant as long as we recognise the complexity of actually who is the beneficiary. So ideally, go back to originally, the initial concept for surplus value actually comes from Adam Smith. It's often associated with Karl Marx, but Karl Marx wrote about it himself. He was referring back to the work of Adam Smith, which in its term had been developed by David Ricardo around the 1870s, 1817. And this term was then first used, though the actual term surplus value was first used by the British economist William Thompson, writing in 1824. But the most famous, the most modern concepts we have today, although it's talk about days, as it was developed by Karl Marx in his theory of surplus value, but also his book Das Kapital, which is his major three-part exploration of the nature of capitalism. Although I would still say Karl Marx's position was broadly correct, we're actually looking at a more complex economy these days, and the much more complicated idea of the interrelationship to the owners of capital, the controls of capital, various other stakeholders. Like I said, we've moved on from the situation where there was very little extraction of surplus value except that done by the money was paid to the workers, and then the rest of the surplus value would be then go into the hands of the capitalists, the owners of capital, some to be taken out as profit and personal aggrandizement, and some would actually then be used to reinvest in the company and to make further developments, etc., and to grow and build the capital thing. So to build up the capital of the company. Okay, so the value generated of surplus values is beyond the costs of the capital. But I said capital itself is often seen as being surplus value reinvested in the firm, and also so we have a source of capital is itself surplus value, and labour reproduction. That is the cost of actually reproducing labour so that you'll have somebody to turn up the day after. So the cost of feeding and clothing and health, etc. for the capitalist, those costs will be paid to labour. Normally they would do that. So what we're actually talking about is who gets this value of the various stakeholders, who gets this value doing that. And of course, these days, the modern world, there are a large number of people who could be seen to get the value, could be shares of it. And this could include people like obviously the employees, it could include the state getting one, the general public also maybe getting shares of that in the way the money is paid out. Many of the old Victorian capitalists actually paid, for instance, for many large parks, etc., paid certain things like that. So they paid directly for certain resources of the state. These days, it would probably be taking taxation and then reinvested into the things like that. So certainly things like that. There are also the idea of directors will obviously take a share, and they may get some of the directors. We're talking about the senior directors, the managers, chief executive officers, etc. Some of that might be in the form of a wage, but some of it will also be in the form of other ways. And we notice there are many varied ways of extracting surplus capital. And of course, we mustn't forget the owners or the share owners themselves. And we must differentiate to a certain extent these days between the owners and share owners, even though historically and simplistically it's often referred to the share owners as being the owners of a company. We can see from many examples that in reality they seem to be more like bondholders of last resort. The bondholder who's paid last after all others are paid, but actually having little or no control of the company directly. Okay, so the concept of modern surplus value is connected intimately to the changing nature of capitalism and the changing nature of capitalists. It's very interesting if you can see a video on who is a capitalist, explains a little bit more about the modern capitalist, who is the modern capitalist, and also some of the concepts of the new capitalists. Okay, surplus value historically was extracted, like I said, mostly as profit, some of it taken out for the aggrandizement of the owner of the company, and some of it recycled back into the company as an investment in order to that the company would be able to actually build new machinery or build new factories, etc., doing that. And this would be capital accumulation as its most basic principle. I will say that actually, the moment the important thing to recognise is that extraction of capital is much more complex these days. It's not just taken out as profit. It can be taken out at various stages by various different people who have the role of capitalists, even if they do not actually have the name of the owners of the company. Because these days we expect that many of the real capitalists are not the shareholders at all, but they're controllers of capital. In fact, many of them can be seen actually through the very banking financial crisis as being standing away from risk. They don't want to take the risk themselves, and so they pass that risk on to others, pension funds, mutual funds, etc., who hold the shares, and in the end are the ones who are often lost out, whereas the actual capitalists continue quite happily in the new business or a new company as controllers, because they often own very, very small percentages of the companies, of the shares that are issued in a company. So this extraction is therefore kind of think about is that some of this extraction is in the form of the social wage, which means that this money goes to companies, from companies to the government. As I said, historically, maybe big mill owners would provide, they would pay for a doctor, or they would pay for a park. But nowadays, of course, a lot of that is done through via taxation, and like that, which argue how much you're doing. And the employee may therefore benefit indirectly via the state and via taxation. So the company makes a profit, it generates a surplus value, some of that percent of the surplus value goes to the state, and in return the state provides back to the employee a social wage, and this can actually be, for example, health, security, etc. Think of all the services that the state offers. So that's one way in which perhaps one of the sets of doing it. Again, this is another matter that confuses some and complicates the idea that so the company may pay to the state a proportion of the surplus value, in return for which it then receives the employee receives back the social wage, etc. And this could also be things like pensions, etc., deferred social wage. So as you can see, the situation is quite complicated. But it's also arguable, many things, that the state itself may also take a share in return for the benefits it's granted to the corporation. And this is one of the oldest questions that goes back to the foundation of capitalism. What is the right of the state to take a share? And of course, many of the free market fundamentalists would argue the state should take as small a share as possible, just the bare minimum for defence, etc. And what it should do with that share itself. So this is a fundamental argument that we've seen in many places. What right has the state to take a share, and what's that? And so on one side, we said it may actually be the state is not so much taking a share as redistributing aspects of a collective aspect of the social wage, things that it's more difficult for the employee to buy personally or buy individually, so the state may choose to do that. So, for example, the health, security, education, and the like. But also, I think the other fundamental thing that we need to look at is why should the state be entitled to take it? And one of the areas that we look at for that is, of course, the idea of incorporation. And this is the idea that actually the state should receive a share of the surplus value, which it can then redistribute back to the employers or back to the other stakeholders, because the other stakeholders in society, for instance, the wider general public or the education system, etc., of that, these will suffer somewhat or have some disadvantage from the idea of the incorporation benefits. So the historically around the idea of corporation, the right of corporation, was the fact that it granted the company limited liability, which of course means that the shareholders are not having to pay the debts of the firm if the firm goes bust. These costs will therefore be developed and taken on by society. Therefore, society should receive some aspect of the surplus value in order to grant the rights of liability and perpetual existence, the idea that firms can go on and on forever and don't need to be folded after each project and reformed for a new project. It's worth remembering that people like Adam Smith, for instance, didn't see the idea of firms as an important or critical part of capitalism. So capitalism was about individuals coming together to work together and selling their labour, etc. And then some of that being used to build up factories and people working together in great big partnerships, etc., rather than doing that. So this is the idea that, but the state that was granted the idea of incorporation. This idea that you can incorporate and you can get limited liability and perpetual existence. And then, of course, the question is this: are these inherent to the idea of private property, or are they concessions? Are they granted by the state as a special legal right? Are they going on like that, or are they something that will actually be something that actually is doing that. And of course, if they are inherent, then there is nothing at all required. If they're a concession, then you can ask for something in return. So basically, if the state is granted these concessions, then it can ask for a payment or some other separate reward or some right to a say in the way a company is run in return for that. But if they're inherent, then you cannot do that. So it's an important thing to argue and consider that. We're not really going to say whether we think it's an inherent or a concession here, but it's something that you need to think about and decide. Okay? If a concession, this would mean that the state would have a right to share the surplus of value, in addition to the value it would get for provision of resources. So if it's a concession, there's an inherent right, perhaps, for it to receive a share of the surplus value. But if it is inherent, then there is no such right to that. If it is inherent, then it is a natural right of the firm, it's a natural right of private property, and therefore there's no need for something to be paid back to it. Be aware that even if you decide that you believe that the state does not have a right due to it being a concession, that they believe that it is an inherent right of private property, there may be other reasons why the state would have a benefit, and that other reasons would be around the payment of the social wages. Exactly. So what we're discussing and thinking about here is the right of broader stakeholders to take something out of the firm because of the fact that they have granted a concession in the way the firm will run. The firm, it is much more efficient and better for easier for the firm, and perhaps it reduces costs for the firm to operate in a manner in which it gets its shares, but actually, and in actually doing this, it pays some element of reward doing that. So this is one of the important things to gather. I mean, this is a very, very old argument. I mean, by 1820, perpetual limited liability become the norm in the USA. So the question is over 200 years old as about this, and this idea of the structure of the corporation and how the corporation operates, and that goes back a long way. And so it's an important part of the debate that we'll be having throughout these sort of lectures and throughout these sort of discussions. So I think it's important for you to think these things through and to decide exactly on the basis of this surplus value how you think it should be provided to the state, etc., and what sort of elements of it should be coming out. So thank you for listening, and I hope you watch some more of these, enjoy some more of these lectures.